Let's start with something rather simple. Take a look at the screen and notice those two squares in the middle. Which one of those two squares is darker? I think most of us would agree that the square on the right with the yellow background is darker. And most of us would be absolutely incorrect. And before you get mad at me, it's 100% true that the two squares are the exact same color, as you can see when I remove the background. There are two things that make this visual a challenge. The first is that I asked you which square was darker, and as a result, your brain was looking for and on some levels wanted to see one square as being darker than the other. The second problem is really about color spectrums playing a trick on your eyes, and that doesn't really matter. When this video is over, I promise you, you will never look at silver supply and demand numbers the same. In fact, you will never believe anyone who tells you that there is a silver shortage or that we're going to run out of silver. What is good, Stackers University? Well, I wasn't planning on putting out a video midweek, but between the comments from my last video and someone forwarded me Silver Dragon's recent video about silver supply, I felt that I needed to drop this video proving that there isn't a silver shortage. So let's go. I want you to hear me clearly. I understand that what we are about to cover may be hard for some of you to believe new information that contradicts what you've heard repeatedly and ultimately have accepted as fact. As the saying goes, repeat a lie often enough and people will believe it. The first barrier we have to overcome is related to cognitive bias. In a nutshell, cognitive bias is about our tendency to look for and find and interpret data in a way that supports what we already believe. If you want to be a successful investor and even a successful person, you have to develop the skill of seeing things the way they are, not the way you want them to be. You have to develop the skills to understand that these two yellow squares are the same color regardless of how they are framed. Remember, your brain is the smartest and most powerful computer ever, and it's quite capable of playing tricks on you, especially when you want to believe things to be a certain way. It's okay, I got the receipts. I'll prove that there's no silver shortage and that all of this is nonsense. Let's start by making sure that we are all singing from the same sheet of music by defining a few terms. If we have supply equaling demand, we would say that market is in balance. If we have supply exceeding demand, we would say that market is in surplus. And of course, if we had supply below demand, we would say the market is in deficit. Now, the first point of contention when it comes to silver demand is whether or not investor demand should be included. Unfortunately, because the Silver Institute includes it, a majority of people accept that as the correct way that should be done. However, when dealing with commodities, you're not really supposed to include those numbers for a couple of reasons.
There's not a deficit. Silver promoters will add silver investment demand or surrogate numbers that they claim represent enormous amounts of silver investment demand on a net basis to fabrication demand and then say, oh, there's a deficit, so you should be buying silver. You don't put investment demand in your supply demand calculations.
Regardless, as you can see here, the Silver Institute does include investor demand, which ultimately leads to more confusion about silver being in a deficit and potential silver shortage or running out of silver. I will address that in a moment. For the sake of this video and our discussion, we're going to accept the Silver Institute's approach. As you can see by the red circles, according to their numbers, the silver market has been in a deficit for the last 4 years, as well as in 2016 and 2019. Now, if you stop there, it definitely looks like we could run out of silver. But we have to ask ourselves some important questions if we're really going to understand this issue. First, how have the silver deficits been covered over the last 4 years in particular? Let's hear it directly from the horse's mouth. The next clip is from Philip Baker, former CEO of Hecla and former chairman of the Silver Institute.
Yeah, it comes from above ground inventories, and you got two categories. You have reported inventories, and by inventories, I'm talking about silver that is on the COMEX or the LBMA or the Shanghai, and that's about 1.7 billion ounces. Mm-hmm. And then you have about another 3.3 billion ounces that is unreported.
Wait a minute, Dr. Stack, are you telling me that there are 1.7 billion ounces in public facilities like the COMEX, and on top of that, there are at least 3.3 billion ounces of unreported silver sitting in private facilities that no one knows about? Nope, I'm not telling you that. Philip Baker, former chairman of the Silver Institute, is telling you that. All I'm doing is pointing out two issues. One, while people focus on the deficit, which includes investment demand, people can conveniently forget to mention the years where there were surpluses that went into storage facilities. And two, people act like silver that the investors buy goes to silver heaven. And three, there is a whole other collection of silver being stored in private depositories that are never discussed. Instead, the focus is always on public depositories, mainly because that's the number we can see. But remember, all those battle cries of let's drain the COMEX, yeah, good luck with that.
A lot of myths around the silver short squeeze back in 2021. And I'm curious, since I have you now, I'm going to ask you, like, how close were we to a proper silver short squeeze?
Look, that is a very hard thing to achieve on a commodity.
Were we close to running out of silver?
No, we've got, as I said, we've got all this silver that's unreported.
There's at least twice as much silver available than we are aware of. In fact, take a look at these sections taken directly from the 2024 World Silver Survey, where they address and acknowledge that the additional silver supply comes from unreported silver inventories. If you actually read a little bit further, they say, quote, "For now, there remains enough silver inventories to fill these gaps, and we understand there remains bullion inventories held elsewhere. For now, there remains enough silver inventories to fill these gaps, and we understand there remain bullion inventories held elsewhere. Stockpiles are finite, however, and eventually this drawdown will create tight physical market conditions and ultimately fuel price rallies." Notice that they said eventually it will create a tight physical market that will result in price rallies, not a shortage, and not that we're running out of silver. Who uses words like silver shortage and running out of silver? Typically the hypers and snake oil salesmen who want you to buy as much silver as you can, but only if you buy it from them before it becomes unobtainium.
If you only look at London and COMEX inventories, you might have the impression that inventories are relatively tight, but you're missing 90% of the market. You're looking at that little maroon band. You're excluding the blue ETF stuff, and you're excluding all of the other silver that's out there.
So let's be clear, the former chairman of the Silver Institute just told us that basically there's around 5 billion ounces of silver available to the world above ground. Jeff Christian and the CPM group calculate that number to be closer to 5.5 billion ounces. I mean, if the deficit is around 200 million ounces a year, it would take 27.5 years just to deplete what we currently have in above ground inventories. In fact, if you look at the Silver Institute numbers again, not including 2024, every year, the net physical investment exceeds the amount of the actual silver deficit that we are in. That silver isn't consumed and lost to industrial application. It's stored in your home or in a private depository, which don't report their numbers. It's just that simple. Over the last 10 years, the reason for the silver deficit can be directly attributed to net physical investment, which has been met by taking silver from the 5.5 billion ounces of above ground stores. So what does the former chairman have to say about us running out of silver?
No, we've got, as I said, we've got all this silver that's sitting,
unreported.
That's unreported. And if you think about those investors that own that, if they know this is a short-term, just squeeze, someone trying to squeeze it, then they can just sell right into it. They will provide the silver.
Yeah.
This is exactly why Jeff Christian and others say that investor demand should not be included in supply and demand calculations, because that silver is still available for the right price, of course.
You know that people who are actually in the business of storing silver are not concerned that we're running out of above ground refined silver inventories.
Now, let's spend a few moments digging a little deeper into recycling and investor demand. In my previous video, I shared a story where there are several companies that are now capable of recovering 90% of the silver from solar panels and other photovoltaic applications. On top of that, we all know that as the price of silver increases, so will recycling from industrial applications, and people bring back their jewelry and silverware and have those smelted, which means additional ounces coming back into the supply. Jewelry and silverware represent anywhere from 200 million to 300 million ounces in demand, which if 25% of that metal is returned or recycled, that's another 50 to 75 ounces annually. Remember, the cure for high prices is high prices. Can I be certain that those numbers are correct? No. But can anyone be certain about the future demand? No. All we can do is come up with a fair best guess. What I do believe is a safe guesstimate is based on the new technology and human behavior, the recycling number could at least double. If recycling double, that would be more than enough to return the market to surplus. While investors' demand is strong now, take another look at this chart and notice what happens to inventories whenever prices increase. We end up with a surplus of silver. We as investors simply don't buy as much silver when silver prices are higher, and higher prices results in lower demand. And if all that I shared wasn't enough to convince you let me put a cherry on top of this delicious little ice cream sundae of truth that I'm serving up. Let's pull up the US debt clock and see what they calculate in terms of silver reserves in the ground. Interestingly, they say that we have another 18 billion ounces of silver in the ground. I know what you're going to say. Well, those could take decades to mine. Well, I just showed you based on the reserves, we have around 27 and a half years. And yes, many of those ounces are not economically mineable at $30 silver, but I bet you there are a whole bunch of them that are at $100 silver and higher. So let's pull this all together to make sure we're all on the same page. 1, using the Silver Institute number, silver has been in a deficit for the last 4 years. 2, net investor demand is what has driven that deficit. 3, deficits have been covered by above ground inventories. 4, it's estimated that there are around 5.5 billion ounces in above ground inventories. 5, please note that the same investor demand that causes the deficit, as measured by the Silver Institute, comes from above ground depositories only to be returned to above ground stores of the metal. So in some ways, it's kind of like moving money from your left pocket over to your right pocket. 6, there are 3 sources of silver which are likely to offset increases in demand: investor stores of silver, increased recycling, and the smelting of silverware and jewelry. 7, investor demand is elastic and tends to decrease as prices increase. 8, there are more than 18 billion ounces of identifiable and mineable ounces of silver in the ground. The challenge for us as investors is not that we don't have access to information. The real challenge is determining who to listen to and which information is actually valuable in comparison to what the promoters, marketers, and hype people push as their narratives. Regardless of what they say, we aren't running out of silver, and we're not likely to run out of silver. You heard that from Jeffrey Christian, and you heard that from Phillips Baker, who was the former CEO of Hecla and a former chairman of the Silver Institute. Finally, you don't buy or hold onto your silver because you believe that at some point we're going to run out of silver and it's going to be this real market event and who knows what's going to happen. You buy silver because of all the legitimate reasons and the variables that will drive prices higher over the next 5 years, or because the funny money we use is only going to make the silver more valuable over time. In the comments section, did I finally change your mind about claims of a silver shortage or us running out of silver? What factor was most compelling? Or simply put an A+ in the comments to acknowledge all the time and hard work it took for me to put this video together, or just to let everyone know that you always stack smarter and never stop learning.